In Microsoft, we have two types of logical networks. The first I want to talk about is a workgroup. A workgroup has no centralized authentication. This is the type of network that you would use at home. If you have a desktop and a laptop, or you have a spouse, your kids, they have their own computers, they all connect to your home network, that's going to be a workgroup type network. So let's say I have 3 computers. I'm just going to call them A, B, and C. Well, here, with my lack of centralized authentication, that means each computer has to have a user account for users that need to log into that computer. So let's say computer A. For computer A, let's say Bob owns computer A. That's the computer Bob uses every day. That's Bob's desktop. Then Bob has a user account on that computer. Every computer has something called a local SAM. SAM stands for Security Account Manager. This is actually a hidden database on all Windows operating systems, so you can't see the actual database. But one of the things it contains is user accounts. So this computer has a little hidden database on it, and that is where Bob's user account actually resides. This database only resides on computer A. So I have a desktop. I create a user account for Bob on that desktop. In my house, that's the only computer he can log into. Let's say Sarah. Sarah uses computer C, so Sarah has a user account on computer C. And that little security account manager database, that's where Sarah's account resides. Sarah can only log into computer C. Let's say they have a child, Joe. Same thing. Joe has an account only on computer B, so he can log into computer B. These computers have no relationship to each other. The only thing they even have in common is they happen to be connected to the same physical network, whether that's through an Ethernet cable or wireless. They're on the same network. That is the only thing they have in common. If Bob needs to log into Sarah's computer, maybe once in a while he needs to log in to do something, then you would have to go to computer C and you would have to create a new user account for Bob on computer C. You would set the password, you would do all those things. If Bob needs to change his password and he changes the password on computer C, when he logs into computer C, he would have to use that password. If he then goes and logs into computer A, he would have to use whatever password he last set on computer A. Again, these computers have nothing in common other than they're connected to the same network. So that's what I mean by no centralized authentication. You have to have a user account on each computer in a workgroup that you log into, otherwise you can't log into it. There's also no centralized administration, meaning if I want to manage any setting on any of these computers, you have to do it locally on that computer. For example, let's say I have a family picture and I want that family picture to be the wallpaper on all 3 of these computers. Well, you would have to go to computer C and change the wallpaper. Then you would have to go to computer B and make that change, and then to computer A. There's not one place you could go and say, set this wallpaper across all 3 computers right now. In a workgroup, you can't do that. Any type of administration has to be done on individual computers. When it's time to install Windows updates, you have to configure the Windows update setting on each of these computers individually. So again, not one place I could go to control any type of setting like that. Microsoft also has a maximum of 20 computers that they support in a workgroup. Now that's an interesting number, the 20 computers. The reason it's interesting is because it's a concurrent, or you could say simultaneous connection. Let's say on computer C, we have a folder and I want to share this folder. So I'm just going to label it as share for now. But I want users on other computers to be able to connect to this share. Well, the limit that Microsoft imposes is you can have no more than 20 users connected to this share at one time. So if Joe were to connect, Bob were to connect, you can do that, but it can never exceed 20 because Microsoft said so. If this were Windows Server 2022 or any Windows Server operating system, you could have an unlimited number of users connect to that share. So Microsoft just set this cap of 20 concurrent connections. So for that reason, everything you ever read about a workgroup will say it supports a max of 20 computers. Now, if you had 30 computers connected to the same network and they're all in a workgroup, then you do have a workgroup of 30 computers. That is not a problem in any way unless more than 20 try to connect to the same shared resource at the same time, which realistically that would be unlikely. Microsoft also says a workgroup has low security. Now, what we mean by low security really goes back to administration. Any change has to be made on each individual computer. If you were to create a new firewall rule to block a certain type of traffic, well, you would have to go to computer A, then you'd have to go to computer B, then you would have to go to computer C and make that change. Same for Windows updates, as I said earlier. You would have to go to each of these computers individually if you wanted to manage any settings related to Windows Update. So for that reason, overall, Microsoft says it is lower security because onus would be on us to manage each one of these computers individually. Now, when I say us, really we mean whoever uses the computer. Bob would manage settings on computer A, Joe on B, Sarah on C. So overall, low security from the lack of administration that we would have. The other typological network is a domain. This will be our primary focus in this course. A domain has centralized authentication. Now, in this picture we have here, in a domain-based environment, I'm going to have my clients. So this time I'm just going to call them 1, 2, and 3. So I have my 3 computers, but now we have a server operating system. So we'll say this is our server 2022. The way this actually works now, with the centralized authentication, my user accounts get stored on the Windows server. If I have a username, Rob, Tony, and Rachel, their user accounts will not be created on their client machines. Instead, their user accounts will be created on my server. Now, the software we use on a server to create the users is actually called Active Directory Domain Services, or ADDS. This Active Directory Domain Services software lets me create, manage users, computer accounts, groups. So that is our centralized authentication. What happens, these 3 computers would get joined to the domain. What happens now, when Rachel needs to log in, she will type her username and password, and her credentials are automatically sent to this server. And if they authenticate, that's the correct username, correct password, then Rachel is able to log in from this computer, and now she's on the desktop. So that would happen for every user in our environment. Now, if Rachel forgets her password, she could simply call the help desk and say, I need to reset my password. I would go through my Active Directory server, which we normally call a domain controller. Now, we know in Microsoft we shorten everything, so you'll often see the term DC for domain controller. But a domain controller is nothing but the Windows server that runs Active Directory domain services. But now, on this server, if Rachel were to forget her password, I would simply reset her password on this one server, and she could log in with the new password as soon as we reset it. We also have centralized administration. With centralized administration, if I need to create a policy to manage Windows updates, I do that from my domain controller, and it processes out to these 3 computers we have in the image. So I have complete control over all my users, all my computers, even other servers in the environment through this centralized administration. Now, as we'll see, there is a design component to this, because if I'm in an environment with 50 users, not too difficult to manage. If I'm in an environment with 80,000 users, they're all going to be domain users, but it's various ways this could be designed, as we'll see in some of the upcoming lessons. Our last 2 characteristics here. A domain can have an unlimited number of computers, so non-issue as to how many devices you actually join to the domain. And it is considered high security. The reason is because centralized administration. Microsoft assumes that we'll do a good job, but administration is far more simplified in a domain environment than it would be in a work group. Because in the domain environment, I can manage settings across all these clients from that actual Windows server that's my domain controller. I don't have to go to each individual client and make any of those changes. So for that reason, we consider this to be high security.